A number of years ago, it was 2005, I was wound up having dinner with Al Gore, the former vice president. And dinner with Al Gore is taxing. Because he's fully engaged and has all kinds of opinions. And he was beating up on me about the first two books I'd written about Bush and his wars, saying that I failed to condemn the war sufficiently, and that he felt very strongly against the war and so forth. And I said, no, look, my job is to find out what happened. And he said, well, no, wait, in Watergate, you took a stand. And I said, no, we didn't. And that the job of the reporter is empirical, find out the facts as much as possible. And he didn't quite buy that, but I persisted. And then we got into a very interesting discussion about how much of consequential events in a presidency is in the public realm. And I said, for instance, you were vice president to Bill Clinton for 8 years. Of the things that went on that are important, how much do we know? I'd written books on Clinton, dozens, hundreds of books on Clinton at that point, 24/7 coverage of his presidency in many ways, newspaper articles, saturation, coverage. So how much of what went on that's important do we know? I asked hopefully. And Al Gore said 1%. And I immediately thought to myself, you mean there are that many women we don't know about? And then I said, now suppose you were vice president, you were there, suppose you wrote a tell-all memoir. And he said, no, I'd never do that. And I said, now suppose you did. Told us everything you knew that was important. How much would we know? And he said, 2%. Now he obviously wanted to stick it to me and was trying to be provocative. But that's the question. For me as a reporter and a book writer, that's the question for you as a citizen. In other words, of what goes on, which of course really defines who people are. How much do I know? In other words, in making a judgment, is it 1%, 2%, 50%? I tend to think it's in the 60 to 70% range, but you don't know what you don't know. And what the job of a reporter is, or in my case, when I spend most of my time on these books or long-range projects, is to move that percentage from the 1 or 2 or 5% realm up into a much higher percentage so people can make, it sounds like a cliche, and it is, informed decisions. And let me just give you an example of, I want to give you two examples. One going back to the post-Watergate period. It was September 1974. And Gerald Ford had been president for 1 month. And some of you may recall this period. He went on national television early on a Sunday morning and granted Nixon a full pardon for Watergate. And I think Ford went on television early on a Sunday morning hoping no one would notice. But people did. And I happened to be asleep in a hotel room in New York that Sunday morning. My colleague, Carl Bernstein, we'd worked on Watergate together, called and woke me up. Said, have you heard? I said, no, I've been asleep. I haven't heard anything. And Carl, who then and still has the ability to explain what went on in the fewest words with the most drama, said the following: the son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch. Even I knew what had happened. And in that time, it was assumed, and I pretty much adopted this, that there was something dirty in the pardon, a deal. Here, 40 people went to jail, all of Nixon's key people, really, and the guy at the top gets a pardon and a free pass. And I thought that for a long time, 20, 25 years, and then I decided to do a book on the legacy of Watergate and examine what Watergate and the residue and the lessons, or the failure to learn lessons, had done to the presidencies of Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton. And in the course of reporting that, I called up Gerald Ford and said, I had not met him, I had not interviewed him, and said, I'm doing this book, and I'd like to talk to you. And he said, sure. And so I interviewed him for hours in New York City, in Colorado, where he had a house, in California, which was his primary residency. And my tape recorder going, I talked to everyone who was still alive, read the books and articles, delved into the presidential libraries of the legal memos on the pardon and so forth. And to compress the story, concluded that, in fact, Ford had done the right thing. That it wasn't dirty, that there wasn't really a deal. And what Ford said, and what the record supported, is Ford realized that the country needed to get over Watergate, that if Nixon was indicted, tried, even put in jail or something like that, it would be 2 or 3 more years of Watergate, and that he wanted his own presidency and felt the country needed to move on to other issues. It was the middle of the Cold War, great, significant economic problems and so forth. And so I wrote this in the book, and essentially mea culpa, that I assumed there was something that was dirty in the deal. It turned out it was the courageous thing to do. Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John Kennedy, called me up and said she read this, and that they had decided they are going to give Gerald Ford the Profiles in Courage Award for giving Richard Nixon a pardon. And then there was Teddy Kennedy at the Kennedy Library giving this award to Gerald Ford. Teddy Kennedy, who at the time in 1974 denounced the pardon as corrupt and a deal, saying he, too, was wrong. That, in fact, what Gerald Ford did was gutsy, courageous, probably cost him being elected president in his own right in 1976. Now, this seared itself into my brain. It looks one way, for sure. This is the way it is. And it turns out, when you look at what happened through the lens of history, indeed, but by saturation reporting, it looks the exact opposite. So, in March of 2003, we launched the invasion of Iraq, and I have written these 3 books on Bush and his wars, and the 4th I am at work on will be out in September, Bush at War Part 4. My wife says if there's a Bush at War Part 5, she is going to shoot me. I think it will be the last book. Somebody in the Obama campaign said, your next book can be called Obama at Peace. The Iraq War is the most important thing going on in the world right now. A war always is defining. If you travel abroad at all, it defines who we are. The Iraq War does. If you think about it in a more important way, it defines who we are to ourselves, this war. And the outcome is going to determine essentially the place the United States has in the world in the coming decades. It is a truly defining event. So when the invasion was launched in March of 2003, the Washington Post said to me, take 1 year and find out what happened and why. And it's a great luxury. How many people here in your business or life have ever been able to spend 1 year on one thing? Raise your hands. Couple. Academics, right? Right. Okay. Academics and journalists. And so I worked through sources in the intelligence world, the Pentagon, the military, State Department, the White House, low level, worked up through the information chain to assistant secretaries, people in sensitive positions in the White House or the intelligence world, finally the cabinet officers, and assembled, I would say after 9 months, quite an account of what had gone on behind the scenes, the 60%, 70% solution. And I wrote this out in a memo, 21-page memo in chronological order, and I sent a copy of that memo to President Bush. My colleagues at the Washington Post said, Woodward, sent George Bush a 21-page memo? You have finally lost it. There's no evidence, one said, there's no evidence in all of his years at Andover, Yale, and Harvard Business School that he ever read anything that long. Wrong. He read it right away. Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, called me in and said, you are going to write this series for the Washington Post, and you are going to write your book, whether you talk to the President about this or not. And I said, of course. She said, he will see you tomorrow. So for 2 afternoons, I interviewed him for a total of 3.5 hours. Researchers at the Post have looked at this, and as best we can tell, it's the longest interview a sitting president has ever given on a single subject. Now, in 3.5 hours of interviewing George W. Bush, how many questions do you think I got to ask? Somebody said 1. That would be if it was Bill Clinton. And in that case, that might be high. I think it's possible to interview Clinton for 3.5 hours and never ask a question. In the case of Bush, I asked him 500 questions. He gives short, direct answers. And if you were to look at a transcript of it, you would see it's very much like a legal deposition. It's not, what did you feel about Saddam Hussein, but on this date, there was this meeting, or there was this intelligence report, or Secretary of State Colin Powell wanted to do the following. What did you think? Why did you do it? What did Cheney say? What was your attitude? What was the conversation like with Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, on this date, and so forth? It's truly an excavation of his mind and a detailed look at the road he walked. Now, it's in war, as it is evolved in this country, the President, as Commander-in-Chief, can employ the force as he sees. There's no vote in the National Security Council. The Congress did vote resolutions supporting a war if Bush decided, but he truly is the decider. I was talking to a group recently, and trying to make this point, and they said, no, wait a minute, the Constitution says only Congress can declare war. The Constitution says that, but Democratic, Republican presidents in the modern era have exercised their authority as commander-in-chief to go to war as they determine, and they can send the force. And I was making the point, I said, look, George Bush could invade Mexico tomorrow if he wanted, and somebody yelled out, don't give him any ideas. But he has that authority. So it is on his head and shoulders that he made this decision. And the question is, what did he do? Why? What is the question pulsing always throughout a discussion like this with the president who's made a war decision? Why? What'd you do? What were you thinking? What'd people say? What data did you have? What did you bring to the table? What were your attitudes and assumptions? And I won't go through it all. It's in the second book I did called Plan of Attack, which takes that 16-month period after 9/11 and how and why Bush decided to go to war. But at one point in this discussion, not because of something I asked, but all on his own, he just said the following: I believe we have a duty to free people, to liberate people. Now think about that. Duty. It is the biggest word in the English language for a sitting president. A duty to free and liberate people, and I challenged him. It's not in the Constitution, it's not in any law, and I just said, aren't lots of people going to think it's dangerously paternalistic of the United States to say we have this duty to liberate people? And then he really got excited and started slapping me around, not physically, but verbally. And he said, you don't get it. You do not understand. You're an elitist. Imagine being called an elitist by George W. Bush. But I took it. And he said, and not understanding, you've got to realize, he said, and I tell you, he is jumping in his chair in the Oval Office when he says this. You've got to understand that those of us who took our countries to war, Tony Blair, Great Britain, himself, the Prime Minister of Australia, we have a zeal, President's word, zeal to free people. Now, zeal, second biggest word in the English language for a sitting president. If we had Hillary Clinton, Senator Obama, and John McCain here on the stage, and we gave them sodium pentothal, the truth serum, it might take a lot of the drug. And we said, what do you feel a duty to do beyond the Constitution and the laws? What do you have a zeal to do as president? We would know an immense amount about them. I cite this as even now, 2008, as we've passed the 5th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, that the driver, there are lots of other reasons why we went to war, but the driver for Bush, the person who decided, is this sense of duty in this sense of zeal. Now, you may argue against it and hate it, but it is a fact. And I cite it now in 2008 because you have to understand that to account for his persistence, his refusal to alter course, really, to stick with it, that he believes in that duty and that zeal.